I love short stories that have a surprise twist at the end. Like they're those kind that the setup and it's going and you're like, I know exactly where this is going. I know what's gonna happen next. What? I didn't see that coming. That was awesome. And then it's some surprise ending and it's like great when it's really funny, or there's some that are like, oh, really poignant. And you're like, wow, that is great writing. I really appreciate great writing. So I always love that. So do you know what I'm talking about? Do you have one of those, or you've read one of those before? You know, can you think of that feeling and be like, oh, that was so good? Let's just do that right now. Pretend that just happened. Awesome. That's great. Great, because I couldn't come up with one to bring you that was clean. So anyway, it's especially nice when they have a nice, tidy ending. You know, there's a surprise twist which you didn't see coming. It's really fun, but then it's like, oh, and that makes the light bulbs go off for everything else, and it just, oh, I get it now. That wasn't what was happening. Oh, and then exposes your own assumptions. Sometimes it exposes your own, stereotypes and biases and challenges you. Those are so good and exciting. Forgive me if what I'm about to say is heretical in your opinion. I kind of wish that Jesus had taken a writing workshop on that kind, because sometimes he gives this really cool parable and this wild twist, and you're like, awesome. Huh? Wait, what? And then it now doesn't make any sense, and you have no idea what he's trying to say, and you're very confused. Like this one. Luke chapter 16 follows Luke 15, but Luke 15 is great, and I've got like all this stuff on it, but the lectionary today is Luke 16, and I'm like, I'm gonna do the lectionary. And sometimes I get a little overly ambitious. Okay, it's my fault. But this is exactly one of those parables that doesn't leave things all cut and dried, neat and tidy, with a bow on it. It's got very messy corners, holes, and some ribbon, but definitely not in a bow. Jesus also said to his disciples, a certain rich man heard that his household manager was wasting his estate. He called the manager in and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give me a report of your administration, because you can no longer serve as my manager. Okay, first, I'm going to pause here and go, that's a little odd. Don't you think it would have done like the independent audit or investigation or something before he told the guy you're fired, and then said, bring me the evidence I need to fire you? That seems a little ill thought out, odd, but that's what he does. So the household manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is firing me as his manager? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. I know what I'll do. I know what I'll do so that when I am removed from my management position, people will welcome me into their houses, one by one. The manager sent for each person who owed his master money. He said to the first, how much do you owe my master? Which also points to the poor bookkeeping, because I would have thought he would have known that. Anyway, how much do you owe my master? He said, 900 gallons of olive oil. The manager said to him, take your contract and write 450 gallons. Then the manager said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 1,000 bushels of wheat. He said, take your contract and write 800. The master commended the dishonest manager. Wait, what? That's not where I thought this was going. The master, the boss, the rich guy, commended the dishonest manager because he acted cleverly. That word translated here, cleverly, is also sometimes translated shrewdly, prudently, some different connotations there. People who belong to this world are more clever in dealing with their peers than are people who belong to the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to make friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcomed into the eternal homes. Okay, now I'm more confused. Are y'all with me? Are you in the same place? Okay. So also interesting here, that worldly wealth, the word, that adjective there, worldly wealth, is actually the same word in Greek as is translated dishonest in front of manager. So it could be read dishonest wealth. Okay, Jesus, maybe you'll start to wrap it up now and it'll become clear. I need the light bulb. Whoever is faithful with little is also faithful with much, and the one who is dishonest with little is also dishonest with much. Okay, like that I can buy, but I don't see what it has to do with the parable we just heard. Okay. If you haven't been faithful with worldly wealth, or as I just said, dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you haven't been faithful with someone else's property, who will give you your own? Again, I'm like, I kind of see that, but not in relation to what we were just talking about. And then, here's the nice and tidy wrap up. No household servant can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be loyal to the one and have contempt for the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Please, Holy Spirit, let us hear what you have to say today to your people. Anybody want to take a stab at that for me? As if you've got a really great idea, you are welcome to take this one. We can tag team. No takers. That's what I thought. I'm kind of relieved, honestly, because at least now I know that it doesn't make a whole lot more sense to you than it does to me. This is one of those where we're we're really not exactly sure how we're supposed to interpret this parable. And here's where I think it is helpful to examine some of our assumptions. Okay, so this is a place where perhaps, like I said in those really awesome short stories that use this tactic, it might be playing on our assumptions and it really is revealing some different ones. Okay? So maybe that's the case. If we assume, and I think it's probably most of our initial assumption, that this rich man, wealthy landowner, whoever the boss, we'll call him, that the boss is the owner and has the right to do whatever he wants with his property, and that he has gained it in an appropriate manner. I think that's kind of our default assumption. And in that case, the manager or steward, in other translations, is cheating, is being dishonest, is cooking the books, and thus stealing from, essentially, his boss. Which is then what makes it really odd that the boss says, "Good job." That, to me, I am really confused about that leap right there. So, what if we go with a different set of assumptions? What if the people who originally heard this did not assume, as we do, that the boss is a good or neutral, at least, guy and has, made his fortune in a perfectly acceptable way? What if we know a little bit more about Roman-occupied Galilee in the first century? So what was happening there, in that time period specifically, they were experiencing this drastically widened gap between the rich and the poor. And the people were, had, in the beginning, when they got in this land, God had assigned each tribe different plots. And everyone had land, every single one, except for the people who were in Levi's tribe, and they were granted special exceptions and care because they were in the priestly class. But everybody else had land that was meant to be passed down to your descendants indefinitely. But what had been happening in the century or so leading up to and including this one is that some people had begun buying up and consolidating land, had been in some cases taking it as collateral for loans because certain people's land wasn't doing well, they had a bad year, they needed some money, they would lend them money in exchange, for repayment, and if they defaulted, the land would then belong to the other person, the loaner. And so that had been happening. In other cases, people were just desperate, or they were having political issues with people around them, and things had gotten not as they had been intended to be. And some people had bunches and bunches of land, and increasingly there was more and more peasant people, poor people, who didn't have any land. And so they now have this issue of what do you do with people who don't have land? Like, where do they live? And they have rent and stuff now, and that's a pretty drastic change to the economy. And the interest rates then had gotten a little out of control. It was kind of like the payday lenders or the title loans we see nowadays. The interest rate was way beyond ridiculous. In this case, some New Testament scholars have constructed and believe that the interest rate on money was usually 25%, and on goods, it was maybe 50%. It's pretty steep, a little excessive. And then on top of that, if there was the middleman, the one making deals for the boss, he would put his commission in there too. So then there was this hidden fee, which we know nothing about those kind of things, teeny fine print credit cards. Oh yeah, by the way, if you're 1 day late one time in a million years, your interest rate goes up to 30 million. They would slip that in there. And then there was the part you had to send to Rome for that tax. These are all slid in, and a lot of times they just slid them into the principal, and the vast majority of these peasants and the people taking out loans are illiterate. Anybody else think that counts as exploitation? Guess what? On top of that, the Bible actually says in 4 places, specifically, you shall not charge interest. Do not exploit the poor by charging interest on loans. That's in the category of pretty clearly what they meant. Don't charge interest. And so these rich landowners were not only most likely charging excessive interest rates, oppressive interest rates, but they were doing so explicitly against God's law. Okay, now with that new set of assumptions, let's go back into the story. The rich man here, now we are not necessarily assuming good guy here. In fact, we should be pretty skeptical from the start. Rich landowner guy that pops into the story from nowhere, probably not on the up and up, okay? If that is our assumption, and the manager calls the people in and takes out of that loan balance his cut, his own cut, the commission. Well, that means he's not actually stealing, he's taking the hit himself. That's an entirely different scenario, right? He's then not dishonest, he's actually doing the right thing and forgiving these people's outrageous interest, at least his portion. That's one option. There is also the option he could be forgiving all of the interest, his commission, all the other hidden fees, and everything, and bringing it down to the original amount owed. Now, in that case, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? Well, it's kind of fuzzy, because he could be still seen as stealing from the boss, but he could also be seen as correcting a situation that shouldn't have happened in the first place. That's kind of ambiguous. That's not real clear. If it's that case, if it's that third option that he's forgiven all the interest and returned it to its original loan amount, and now we read on, and the manager says, "Well played. That was pretty smart of you." That makes a little bit more sense, right? Because then what has happened is he can't undo what his manager has just done. Even though he could argue, I fired that guy. He was not authorized to represent me in those negotiations. He was not authorized to speak on my behalf and change those contracts. So those were fraudulently changed, and you need to return them to the original. That's going to be awkward. And because he's going to have to admit what he was doing in the first place, charging at the same time. Say that. If he doesn't go trying to fix that, accepts that loss, the people think that he is benevolent. His manager, right? A really awkward place to, he can't fix that. He's put the boss in what they call a decision dilemma, where there is no way to get out of this that doesn't make him look bad if he doesn't go along with what the manager has done. Okay, so if that makes that part of it make more sense, and I can see Jesus doing something like that, right? You know, if we have a different set of expectations and assumptions, then the part where he says, if you haven't been faithful, wealth, dishonest wealth, you know, or if you haven't been faithful with someone else's property, it also depends on who that someone else is. If we assume, like under our first initial conditions, we assume the other person's property, someone else's property, refers to the boss, in which case that makes that, you know, the dishonest guy. But if Jesus is saying someone else's property, as in what was rightfully the people who owed the money, that the boss was stealing from them, in that case, that would actually be Jesus saying that was a good example of dealing shrewdly or cleverly, operating within a system that was unfair and unjust, and making an adjustment so that you could then live favorably, live in a different way, not have to work for the bad guy. And other people would appreciate that and owe you a favor. Here's the thing. That's not clearly in the text. None of it is. So what we have here actually is an example of how the Bible is just like everyday life. Sometimes it's not real clear who the good guy and the bad guy are. Sometimes there's messed up systems that make things look the way they aren't. Sometimes it's just plain difficult to know how we're supposed to live in a world that's messed up. Sometimes we feel like, I want to live honorably and honestly. I want to live justly. God's big on doing justice. But how do I do that when that's not real clear? Because there's factors I can't control, and there's a system that's messed up. How do I do that? And I think what Jesus' bottom line comes down to is, what shows your most important relationship? Do you prioritize your relationship with God and other people? Or do you prioritize your relationship with stuff and money? Do you say, well, this is just the way it is. Sometimes people get hurt. That's really not my fault. I'm going to do my business this way anyway. I'm going to charge what everybody else charges, interest-wise. Or what if the consequences of doing something differently cause pain in your other relationships? Life is sometimes just messy and unclear. And we don't have a really good, ta-da, here's the story, it explains it all, just do this and everything's fine. I don't love that, but I kind of appreciate the fact that the Bible is honest and real life. It doesn't paper over stuff and pretend that everything's fine and easy. And if you were a good Christian, you would know which way to do that. You would know which way to go. You'd know which decision to make. Everything would be nice and cut and dried. Because frankly, most of the time, that's not been my experience. Most of the time, there are times when I think I'm doing good, and then I realize that I've accidentally contributed to something that I didn't intend to do. And then there's some times that neither way looks right, or they both look right, or they both look ish the same. How do we make decisions? The decisions that we have to make every day. How do we do that in a world of, that kind of clear as mud? If we had a Bible that said, well, here it is, you should know, and if you don't, you must be a bad person. I don't know if I'd have this job. I kind of appreciate that we have a Bible that is like, do the best you can with what you have at the time, and remember whose relationship counts. I think think that's probably about the safest thing I can say. In fact, I think that's something that pretty much all scholars would agree on. We can say that Jesus is clearly saying here, mind your relationship with God. Prioritize your relationship with God. And do the best you can with the other stuff. I know it's not neat and tidy, but how do you feel if I leave it there? Just life? That's where I'm going to leave it then. That is very much the world we find ourselves in today. A world of choices and sometimes way too many choices. And there's lots of different ways to go, and they're all neither 100% good or 100% bad. They're all mostly somewhere kind of in the middle or neutral at least, and it's tough to navigate this kind of world. I think the only way we can do it, clearly with God's help, but what Jesus also says is that it's best to do it together. You can't go this alone. It's too tricky to try by yourself. And that's what the church is about. Not about getting everything right. Not about punishing people who don't. Not about deciding and telling anybody else what to do. The church is about figuring it out together and prioritizing our relationship with God and loving our neighbor. If you don't have a church home, if you are perhaps feeling denominationally homeless at the moment, then we would be honored if you would consider joining with us. We don't make any promises that we get it all right, but we're committed to working it out together. If you'd like to make that decision to join our church or to accept Jesus Christ for the first time, reaffirm your faith if it's been a really long time and you want to make a step in your faith journey, then come and let me know. If you want to, you can do that as we're singing. If you would rather, contact me anytime during the week and we can visit about that. I look very much forward to introducing to you our newest member who joined us this week in my office and will be returning from vacation in a few weeks. So his name is Benny Simpson. And so I told him he would have a wonderful family here when he arrives. And I think you will find him a joy to meet. So would you join me in standing and we will sing one more time together. let us go in surrender to God's will and do the best we can with what we've got. Love God, love your neighbor. The Spirit will take care of the rest. Amen.